Something exploded inside Russia, and for a brief window that many preferred not to imagine, distance stopped offering protection. A residential courtyard became a blast zone. Cars folded into molten scrap. Balconies tore away from concrete. People ran through smoke in the dark, not knowing if another strike was coming. 13 wounded. 9 hospitalized. And behind the flames, a question that is no longer abstract for Moscow. How far is the other side prepared to push this war beyond the front line? What happened in Novaya Adigeya was precise in its timing and brutal in its effect. At 23:39, according to early reports, something struck the parking area of a residential complex in the Tokhtymyrsky district, just outside Krasnodar. Not a military site, not a warehouse. A place where people parked after work. Within minutes, fire spread outward, swallowing vehicles first, then climbing into the apartment building itself. Balconies burned, windows shattered, structural elements were compromised. At least a dozen apartments were damaged. Families were evacuated in chaos, leaving behind blackened rooms, scorched walls, and everyday objects warped by heat. This was not collateral damage near a battlefield. This was war entering a living space. Local authorities reacted quickly, and that speed matters. The head of the Republic of Adigeya, Murat Kumpalov, confirmed that both the residential building and the parking area were hit. Firefighters, medics, police, and emergency services were deployed immediately. Temporary shelters were opened for residents who could not return home. Promises followed: medical treatment, repairs, compensation. On the surface, the system responded. But response does not erase the fact that, for the people who lived there, the boundary between civilian life and military conflict collapsed in a single night. And this is where the story stops being local. Because Adigeya was not an isolated target. According to Russia's Ministry of Defense, the strike occurred during a coordinated wave of attacks across multiple regions. Between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m., Russian air defenses reportedly intercepted 53 drones in just 3 hours. 29 over the Sea of Azov. 7 over Krasnodar Krai and the Black Sea. 6 over Crimea. 2 over Rostov. 1 each over Belgorod and Kursk. Parallel reports indicated an attempted strike on the Oriol thermal power plant. This pattern matters. It signals planning, synchronization, and intent to probe defenses not at the edge, but deep inside. So the first layer is clear. Something hit a civilian area during a wider, coordinated assault. The second layer is more uncomfortable. Why now and why this way? Because saturation drone attacks are no longer just about damage. They are about measurement, response times, coverage gaps, political thresholds. When attacks reach residential courtyards near major Russian cities, they are testing more than air defenses. They are testing patience, narrative control, and escalation tolerance. That is why suspicion quickly focused on the possibility that a Flamingo cruise missile was involved. The technical debate erupted immediately, but the name itself is less important than what it represents. Cruise missiles are not improvised tools. They signal a deliberate choice to employ higher-end capabilities beyond the frontline. Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Shalandin cut through the argument with a blunt observation. It does not matter what exactly hit the courtyard. People were hurt. That is the only fact that truly matters at this stage. His remark reframed the issue. The question is not classification. It is consequence. From Moscow's perspective, the critical task is not arguing online, but reconstructing the chain behind the strike. Launch points, logistics, command authorization. According to Shalandin, Russian security services immediately began that work. This is not symbolic theater. It is forensic and strategic, designed to identify not just the trigger, but the structure that made the trigger possible. In parallel, Russia continues what it describes as systematic group and mass strikes against Ukrainian troop concentrations, temporary deployment sites, command posts, and drone crews. The logic is consistent. If the enemy is probing deep with drones or missiles, the response will not be a single emotional retaliation. It will be a sustained effort to strip away the infrastructure required to repeat such attacks. Shalandin even noted damage to a 750 kilovolt power line during Russian retaliatory actions, underscoring that the response is already affecting strategic systems. Here is the quiet transition from description to judgment. Once civilian areas inside Russia are struck, restraint ceases to be a theoretical virtue. Lines that were previously debated in statements begin to be enforced through operations. Not loudly, not symbolically, but persistently. If you are still following this analysis, it likely means you are not looking for reassurance or outrage. You are trying to understand the direction of travel. And direction matters more than any single explosion. While Moscow emphasizes control and method, rhetoric from Kyiv is moving in a far sharper direction. Ukraine's new defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, declared that his objective is to kill 50,000 Russians per month. This was not a technical estimate. It was a political statement, a way to frame the conflict in terms of quotas rather than outcomes. Shalandin's reaction was dismissive, with what means, in his assessment, Ukraine does not possess that capacity, and such declarations reflect bravado more than battlefield reality, especially from a minister newly installed. But the deeper issue is not feasibility. It is signaling. When a senior official speaks in terms of monthly body counts, that language travels. It reaches Russian civilians who watch their homes burn in Adigeya. It reframes drone and missile strikes as part of an openly stated project of destruction. In Western political discourse, this kind of language is often filtered or softened. That is why it landed differently when Alexander Vasilyev, a former KGB officer now living in London, spoke openly on British television. Vasilyev said something rarely voiced so plainly in mainstream Western media: Russia is winning. Not rhetorically. Strategically. He argued that Russian forces are advancing, and if the war continues, they could take Kharkiv and Odessa, potentially pushing to the Dnieper. This was not presented as propaganda, but as a cold assessment of momentum. If Odessa falls, Ukraine loses access to the Black Sea. Russia gains not just territory, but a fortified defensive arc and a corridor toward Transnistria, a region with a large Russian-speaking population. This changes the frame entirely. From that perspective, Moscow's position becomes asymmetrical. A peace agreement consolidates gains. No agreement allows continued advance. Vasilyev described this as a tragedy for Ukrainians, caught between Russian military pressure and NATO's interest in prolonging the conflict. His point was not moral justification, but structural reality. And that reality clashes sharply with the narrative of Russian exhaustion often presented to Western audiences. Now return to Novaya Adigeya with that context in mind. While ministers trade numbers and analysts draw arrows on maps, families there are filling out damage reports, counting the injured, waiting to see when they can return home. For them, red lines are not concepts. They are cracked walls, shattered glass, and the memory of running into smoke at night. So here is the harder, more strategic question. If cruise missiles or high-end strike systems are being tested against civilian areas inside Russia, what incentive remains for Moscow to limit its response geographically? And if those limits erode, does escalation arrive as a dramatic event, or as a steady tightening that slowly removes the enemy's ability to strike at all? Before this ends, consider which path appears more likely: a sudden return to restraint driven by rhetoric, or a gradual expansion of military objectives justified by necessity. If you have a view on that, this is the moment where serious discussion belongs. In the end, the facts are stark. A residential area was hit. Civilians were wounded. A coordinated attack unfolded across multiple regions. The probable use or testing of advanced weapons signals a willingness to push boundaries. The immediate losers are ordinary people in places like Adigeya. The short-term strategic beneficiary may be the side that uses escalation to justify deeper, more decisive operations. History suggests wars rarely pivot on words. They pivot when lines are crossed and enforced. What burned that night was more than a parking lot. It was the assumption that this war would stay somewhere else. And once that assumption is gone, the conflict does not calm down. It clarifies.